Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of On Being Human Conversations. I would like to apologize for the delay in starting. We were experiencing some technical glitches, but I hope that you're all online and that you've managed to connect. But welcome to this evening's conversation. I'm really excited to be here this evening. My name is Batetsi Matenge, and I will be your host for this evening. I have a lovely guest who will be sharing insights on her side about the nervous system, mental health, emotional regulation, autoimmune diseases, neurocognitive diseases, and all sorts of mental health related topics. So thank you for joining us and thank you for your patience. This is our final episode of On Being Human, Season 1. And I look forward to Season 2. And again, we will be talking all things mental health related and well-being. So please feel free to share any topics or that you would like for us to cover in Season 2, which is coming up in September. So let's get straight into it, just because we're running slightly behind this evening. But I have a very special guest, Dr. Shona Fraser, who is a specialist clinical neuropsychologist. She is one of the very few guests that I often have to read her bio because there's just so much in it. But she is a neuropsychologist. She specializes in neurodevelopmental and neurocognitive difficulties, and she works with individuals and she works with families throughout this journey. Dr. Shona Fraser has a PhD in neuropsychology, and she uses her expertise in neuroanatomy to understand how the brain and mind works together. So she's a perfect guest for us this evening, where we will be talking about how the nervous system impacts mental well-being. So let me hand over to Dr. Shona Fraser, who can tell us a little bit about herself, and then we can get started with our webinar. Welcome, Dr. Fraser, Shona Fraser. Thank you so much for creating time and sharing your skills and expertise with us this evening.
Thanks so much for having me. So actually, Batetsi and I have known each other for a very long time. We go back to working together at Tara Hospital. And that's kind of where I began with my neuropsych training in the state sector. So I started actually at Baragwanath Hospital. I then went to Joburg Jain, and then I landed up at Tara for 7 years, where we set up a neuropsychiatric clinic. And so now I have relocated. I'm now in Belito, and I'm working in private practice, still with sort of neuropsychological cases as far as possible. But now things are looking a little bit different.
All right. Thanks, Shona. And again, thank you for generously sharing your expertise with us this evening. And I look forward to learning from the session, learning from you. And I hope that our viewers as well are looking forward to the session. So please feel free to pop any questions on the chat. We will have a Q&A towards the end of the session. And if you have any thoughts, concerns, questions, please do share in our chat box. But Shona, let's get into it, straight into the meat of the conversation. And you just tell us about what the nervous system is, and why is it so important when we speak about emotional well-being.
So I think what is really encouraging is that we are starting to think more about the nervous system in terms of emotional well-being. And so when we are thinking about it in this way, we want to think about an integrated system. So we have a brain and we have a mind, and both of these exist inside of the body. So when we are thinking about a nervous system, we are thinking about all three holistically. So we can't really ever separate one out from the other. So the nervous system kind of acts as this interface for us between the organism itself and the environment. And it does this in a number of ways. So if we broadly kind of differentiate between the central nervous system as being one part of the nervous system, that's going to be our brain and our spinal cord, then there's a whole nother part of it, which is called the peripheral nervous system. And effectively, this is a whole lot of neurons and kind of nerve endings and fibers that go from the brain and the spinal cord and are distributed throughout the body. And these are made up of sensory and motor neurons. So the sensory neurons are what allows us to take information in from the world. It then sends all of that information up to the brain where our body is represented. And then the motor neurons will take the information from the brain and then send it back through the body. And then we're able to act on the information that's coming in. And so this system is happening very reactively, and it's happening so fast, outside of our conscious awareness. So for example, if I was to touch a hot stove, I would touch it, feel the heat and the pain, and react immediately. And that sort of is a nice example of how quickly these very efficient systems are working. So all of this information is being processed from the world into our brains and then back into the world at lightning speed. So they are very, very efficient systems, and they are biologically built in that way to protect us. And so part of our peripheral nervous system is something called the autonomic nervous system, and it's just one aspect of the peripheral nervous system. And this whole system is designed to balance out our physiology. So there's two kind of divisions of this nervous system, which is our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system. Now, I think that those are becoming more and more spoken about now, so they should sound quite familiar. But we have our sensory nervous system, which is effectively a whole process designed to respond to any kind of perceived stress or threat in the environment. So what happens is that I see something, I see it as stressful, I see it as threatening, and my physiology responds to it outside of my awareness. So it's just this automatic reaction that happens. And my heart rate will increase, my blood pressure will increase, my respiration will increase, getting oxygen to all the different parts of my brain and body that need it. My sensory system is heightened, so I'm taking in all of my environment. I'm very aware of what's happening. I'm hypervigilant. And that is known as a fight-flight response. So this system is really preparing me to react to that stress in some way through either confronting it or running away from it. But now we need for that system to be in balance. And so then we have our parasympathetic nervous system. And this is responsible for down-regulating that sympathetic response. So how the system was designed is that if I am exposed to some kind of threat, my sympathetic system responds and I can either fight that threat off or I can run away from the situation. And then once that threat is removed from the environment, my parasympathetic nervous system then regulates all of my functioning again. So my heart rate goes back to normal, my respiration goes back to normal, and then I'm effectively in a state of calm. And why that is so important is because it is only in this state of calm, this parasympathetic state, that we can experience emotional wellness. So this state is what promotes any kind of health, growth, or restoration. We are unable to restore and experience well-being when we are in a sympathetic state. And so how we perceive these threats and these stresses in the environment is highly, highly individual. And it really just depends on our experiences in the world. So what I might perceive as to be quite stressful or threatening and have that response, you might not. So these become highly individual in accordance with kind of the experiences that we've had throughout our lives. But these responses were only ever meant for immediate and short-term survival. So what that means is that the threat comes into our environment, we then react to it, and then that threat leaves, and then we re-regulate, and then, we carry on. Whereas these days, we actually are dealing with more of a chronic stress problem, where our sympathetic nervous system is then chronically activated, and the system was never really designed for that. And so then that's when we start to develop health issues and difficulties, with mental health, physical health, emotional health. And it's begins in our physiology. It begins with our brain and our physiology.
And Shona, I mean, you spoke about, you named stress as an example of what we are exposed to I mean, stress is something that features in our lives daily. And I think for the audience out there, I think it will be important to sort of understand that there is healthy stress and there's then unhealthy stress. And I think what you are referring to there, Shona, is the unhealthy stress, where
Absolutely.
your stress hormones such as cortisol is consistently high, and that then becomes damaging to our bodies. And Shona, just off that, what are some of the mental health fallouts that come with an overactive parasympathetic system, for example?
Mm. So, B, you make a good point in terms of healthy stress versus unhealthy stress. And so, this system is designed in this way for us to be able to respond to stress because we are never going to exist in a world without stress, right? Is that we will always have some kind of stress or distress. And so, if we have a regulated nervous system where our sympathetic nervous system activates and we become aroused in order to fight the stress and then sort of calibrates back to a homeostatic state, because our bodies and our brains love to be in a homeostatic state, then that fosters resilience. So that's how we can become resilient towards stress. Where we start to see difficulties is when that system is kind of activated and switched on over chronic periods of time. So, if we even just think about what it actually means to have the sympathetic system switched on, is that really, I mean, my heart rate is going to increase substantially. I'm going to increase my respiration, and then that's going to send oxygen up into my brain, but it shuts down higher order functioning because in a survival scenario, we don't need our higher order reasoning. So all of those kind of reasons shut down, and we become a lot more reactive rather than sort of thinking something through. Um, Also, we've got all of these stores of fats and blood sugar in our bodies that then gets released. And so we really experience this massive wave of adrenaline, cortisol, energy, and we are primed to do something with that. But if we consider what that looks like today, it could be responding to an email, it could be, a call from a difficult boss, it could be any number of things. And so this system is continuously switching on, and we're just not having the opportunity to regulate it as much as the system is designed for. And so
Mm,
that's when we start to see difficulties. So one of the main things that sort of happens in this process is that because there's this increase in neurotransmitters, there's this increase in energy, there's this increase in all of these physiological functions, it often leads to inflammation throughout the body. So when cells become inflamed, that is in response to stress. But then sometimes when that happens too much, our immune system quite literally can't maintain that level and it becomes overactive. And then it starts to kill off, all the cells, which is then good cells and bad cells effectively. And that's when we would see autoimmune disorders. So that's something that can happen in our bodies. And then we would see things like chronic fatigue, we would see things like functional neurological disorders where there's nothing that we can see on scans or anything, but a person is presenting with these kinds of symptoms. We can see degenerative disorders, so it can lead to things like Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, those kinds of degenerative processes, which happen over time. They can also be sort of affecting more of the physical. There's asthma, there's type 1 diabetes, there's a whole host of difficulties that happen in this chronically inflamed state and
mm,
without having that regulatory mechanism in place.
mm. Sure, that's fascinating, Shona. I mean, you've listed all the sort of illnesses that I've personally come across, as well as professionally with patients, but also with in my personal life as well. And I want us to speak a little bit more about that. You started off speaking about autoimmune illnesses or diseases. Can you share a little bit more about what the relationship is between autoimmune illnesses and your nervous system? How
Mm.
is there a relationship? Is a positive correlation between the two? How does one develop an autoimmune disease that you have just shared?
So, absolutely, the two are intrinsically related. And so, really, what's happening is, if you cut yourself, your body is automatically going to send a whole lot of cells to try to heal that cut. And there's going to be some inflammation around the cut, and then it's going to form a scab, and then it's going to go through the healing process. And that's also what happens on a cellular level. So, something is now impacting on our cells. In this case, it's going to be the sympathetic response of the nervous system to some kind of perceived threat. And when I say perceived threat, it's really important, I'm speaking about stressors, but it's really important the word perceived, because our nervous system doesn't differentiate between an actual threat in the environment, like something that could actually harm us or kill us, and a perceived threat. So I could still perceive an email or a conflict with a partner or anything like that. I can still perceive to be something incredibly stressful or threatening to the integrity of my internal world. And so the perception of threat is just as concerning as the actual threat itself in terms of how the nervous system responds to it. So if there is this sympathetic response and all of these physiological changes are happening, one of the things that happens is that everything kind of from the immune system is directed to try to heal this inflammation and this the physiological difficulties that are occurring as a result of the arousal. And what happens is that the immune system almost goes into like an overdrive, because now there's just so much. In the presence of chronic stress, there's just so much for the immune system to do. And so it goes into an overdrive state. And then that's when it starts kind of reacting to itself. And then that's when we start to see tissue breakdown, and we start to see the cells the immune system attacking its own cells. And that's when you would get different kinds of autoimmune disorders. So you get some that are, in terms of the central nervous system. So that would be things like multiple sclerosis and, sort of the dementias. Yes.
I was going to just, sorry to interject, Shona. Please, could you explain for the audience, the viewers, they might not know what multiple sclerosis is. So as you
Okay.
go through the different
Yes.
autoimmune diseases, maybe just shed a little bit of light on what those are.
Absolutely. So multiple sclerosis is when there's actual physiological changes happening inside of our brain. And so what you would see on a scan is that you would see a whole lot of kind of white spots that happen around more of our vascular system. And what that is, it's a whole lot of inflammation of those neuronal networks. But what it does is that it really affects the physical functioning of a person. And it's a deteriorating, so it's a degenerative process that happens. So more and more kind of tissue gets damaged. And there's like this sort of ongoing knock-on effect. And then eventually the person does sort of become confined to a wheelchair and then immobilized, entirely. And so it's really just one of those many autoimmune disorders that we don't know the exact mechanism underlying the cause of it, but it has really severe impact for the individual. And there's a long, it goes on, it's a deterioration that happens over a long period of time. And because of that, then, the physical sort of symptoms are ongoing, and the person eventually then loses their ability to move. So that's something, that we see in autoimmune disorder that really does affect the brain. And then we do get other ones as well, that affect different parts of the body. So type 1 diabetes is around, difficulty processing insulin in the pancreas, and then we've got asthma, which is something that more affects the lungs. And then fibromyalgia, which is also relatively common these days as well, is, it affects throughout the whole body, and it can lead to things like chronic fatigue, where if you are to kind of scan the person, or if you are to do any sort of medical testing and things like that, you often won't find an underlying cause. And then just in terms of what we're seeing now is a much higher incidence of functional neurological disorders. So what that is that a person is presenting with something, that looks neurological. So this could be like a seizure disorder, or some kind of, paralysis, anything like that. And there just doesn't appear to be a physical or a medical cause of that presentation. So if somebody is presenting with a seizure disorder and you send them for, scans or for an EEG, nothing can be found on those tests, but they're presenting with seizures. And so it becomes incredibly problematic for their quality of life and their capacity to function, but it can't necessarily be treated in the same way because there isn't that underlying medical cause. And so, we're seeing that a lot more in practice. And it is concerning, and it just means that we would need to treat that more in terms of this system, this arousal system of the autonomic nervous system, that's either then creating this absolute sort of arousal and activation inside of the body, and then not allowing that regulation to happen. And not allowing, or not necessarily not allowing, but it just not being enough to balance out that process. And so, then that is impacting on our neurological functioning, absolutely, and our physical functioning, but also because the system is almost recruited for a defense. So we're defending ourselves against some kind of stressor, or stressors, multiple stressors. Then it becomes almost like a fear-based system that can then manifest as anxiety, that then almost becomes more generalized to the external world. And then that's when we also start to see our more sort of clinical depression pictures, and the anxiety disorders and panic attacks and things like that.
Sure. I mean, I'm myself. I'm processing all of what you've just shared, Shona. It sounds like it's such an intricate process and system where everything is so intertwined, and we can't quite separate, medical well-being from mental well-being. And I think that this is so important to shed light on. And then you also spoke about dementia, vascular dementia. I know there are different types of dementia. Do you want to maybe just sort of shed some light for our viewers on the types of dementia?
Yeah, so I think, B, just to also comment on something that you've just said now is, you said an integrated system, and it absolutely is. We absolutely can't separate out kind of a sort of something that's going to only treat the mind and not the brain and not the body. And we need to think of it as an integrated system, because all of those different aspects of it are completely working on each other. They've all got bidirectional relationships. So what we experience in the mind is going to have an impact on inflammation in our brain and body, and the inflammation in our brain and body is going to have an impact on the mind. So we really do need to think about it as an integrated system. So we do get different kinds of degenerative disorders. So in terms of just how our brain is structured, we've got a cortex, which is, if you were to look at a brain and it looks like a walnut, that area that we're seeing, that is our cortex. And then if we were to look deeper inside the brain, we've got something called our subcortical areas. So it's basically a whole lot of different structures in the brain that are made up of different cells and that are responsible for different functions. And so when we have got a degenerative disorder or a dementia, then we look at, is it cortical? So is it impacting, the outside of the brain that we can see? And what that looks like then is sort of bigger grooves and, more like a walnut appearance, that the cells are actually dying off. And so you can see the volume of the brain actually gets smaller. Or is it a subcortical dementia? And then that more affects things like movement and, the fluidity of movement, and then more of our physical functions. So, for example, Alzheimer's dementia is something that then affects the cortex. And so what that particularly affects is our memory and our executive functioning. So you'll see in an Alzheimer's type dementia, a person will really struggle with remembering, especially short-term memories. And then also will have difficulties with focus and attention, and then some of the executive functions, which are things like planning, reasoning, problem solving, thinking about consequences, all of that sort of thing. And so effectively what Alzheimer's is that the actual neurons, the actual cells in the brain are deteriorating and they are dying off. And so then we see smaller volumes of the areas in the brain that are responsible for memory. Now, that's not necessarily an autoimmune disorder or anything like that, but where these kind of sort of overlap and dovetail together is that if we have higher inflammation in our brain as a consequence of the sympathetic system that's unhealthily and chronically responding to ongoing stress, then we start to see that type of picture emerging where causes this inflammation in the brain, and then that causes the cell damage and ultimately cell death. And then we've got more of our subcortical dementia, which is more in the inside of the brain. And that's things like Parkinson's, where you see people, they have a tremor or they have difficulty moving. And then, they sort of shuffle when they walk. That's because of those areas inside of the brain that then are affected. And again, this is something quite separate but related to the nervous system, but separate necessarily from autoimmune disorders. Is that again, if we've got this chronic inflammation, these chronically high levels of cortisol in the brain, these chronically high levels of adrenaline in the brain, then we really are going to be in quite a bit of trouble in terms of the structural integrity of our brain. And what I mean by that is that, we've got all of these neuronal networks that are designed to be doing certain things, and that if there is a whole lot of inflammation and too much cortisol and too much of any sort of neurotransmitter that creates a disruption to the homeostatic state of the brain, then we are going to start to see damage to those cells and ultimately cell death. And that's where we start to see our dementias. So it's related to the nervous system, but it's also quite separate from autoimmune disorders as well.
Yes, yes. I mean, Shona, I'm sitting here and just sort of wondering. Well, first of all, I would like for you to maybe explain what inflammation in the body is and what are inflammation markers. But I'm also wondering about life experiences that can lead to, this inflammation in our bodies. Earlier on you spoke about, you gave an example of, maybe receiving an email or a distressing call from a boss, but what other life experiences, life events can lead to such a state?
Mm. So, I mean, that's an excellent question because, I think in a lot of the literature, understanding this whole system and how this whole system works, we are described as people, the species of being a person, as being a traumatized species. And what they mean by that is that, either we experience trauma in our lives to varying degrees, or, we have transgenerational transmission of trauma, which is kind of passed down through the generations. But ultimately, and it links with what I said earlier, is that we're never not going to experience distress, and we're never not going to experience some kind of, grief or stress or anything like that, but to varying degrees. So when we experience something, it does get, so like I said earlier, with the kind of taking information in from the world. So we experience something, we take that information in, it's represented in the brain, and then we act it out. And that's how our mind develops. And our mind then develops in relation to previous experiences as well. So if I have, an experience that sort of fosters well-being, then if I ever am in a similar experience, I'll go back to that of being like, oh, that actually was amazing last time, and it's going to be, great this time. So I've got this sort of predictability that I can lean back on. And so how we sort of live in the world is in terms of some kind of expectation, so when I wake up in the morning, I expect that I'm going to survive through the day. I expect that people are inherently benign, so they may not be inherently good or bad, but they're benign and they're not going to harm me. I expect that my environment is relatively safe. And that's how then I can exist in a world, without being, um, completely consumed by any kind of anxiety. So if there is a violation of that expectancy, so for example, if I believe that people are inherently benign and then a person does harm me, that's going to then get laid down in my brain as people are not inherently benign, people are inherently harmful. And so that's going to then become part of my experience. And in trauma, and when we experience trauma in these ways, and again, sort of the varying levels of trauma and the varying degrees to which we experience trauma, we kind of develop these mental models of what is safe and what is not safe. So, for example, if I'm driving and I stop at a robot and I get hijacked, that's going to then be a violation of my expectancy that I'm going to be safe at this robot, which is then going to cause trauma. Now, a few days later, I might be driving again and I might stop at a robot and somebody comes to my window because they want to sell me something. I may then have exactly the same response that I had internally, physiologically, to this person that has now approached me who's completely benign. He just wants to sell me something, as I did when I was harmed by the person before. And that's where we start to see the PTSD syndromes, the post-traumatic stress. But effectively there, what's happening is I've now I've had this experience of trauma. And so now I become even more vigilant to my surroundings. I'm even more aware of everything that's happening because now anything could hurt me, that anything could be a threat. So now I become hyper vigilant, I'm hyper aware, and that comes in that whole sympathetic system. And then I've got a decreased reactivity to what I perceive to be a threat. So I may just react in all of these situations as though I'm being harmed, even though I'm not. And so when we experience that over and over, it affects the development of our brain and it affects the integrity of our brain. And so our brain, well, and I suppose all of our cells, but I'm going to speak specifically about the brain because that's my area as opposed to the rest of the body. But the brain is made up of a whole lot of neurons. And these neurons they're cells that they kind of look like trees, I suppose, inside, and we've got billions of them in our brain. And when something happens, so let's say, for example, I've got this increase of cortisol in response to something that's happened to me in the environment, then my brain goes out of homeostasis. So things go out of balance because now I've got more of a neurotransmitter than my brain knows what to do with. And so over time, then this starts to affect the actual structures of the neurons. And that's where we see inflammation. So these neurons start to get damaged. And when they start to get damaged, they're going to send in a whole lot of other cells to try and fix the damage. In the same way that if I was to cut my hand, the skin also does the same thing. But they send in a whole lot of cells to fix the damage. But if the stressor, if the trauma, if the response is chronic, then eventually I'm not going to be able to send in enough help from the other cells to fix those parts of the brain that have been implicated in terms of the imbalance of the neurotransmitters, the imbalance of the functioning of those structures. I hope that makes sense in terms of inflammation.
Yes, in a very in a very rich way.
Okay.
It does make sense. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the question that comes to my mind is what can we do, as individuals to take care of our nervous system? How do we make sure it's regulated? How do we make sure that cortisol levels are not highly elevated on a day-to-day basis?
So I think that's the big question, and there are a number of different things that one can do. So like I was saying earlier, is that we're never not going to be stressed, so we're always going to have the sympathetic nervous system switching on. But where we start to become resilient is if we can put things in place to down regulate into that parasympathetic, rest and digest, promoting health growth and restoration, in that more sort of balanced and homeostatic space. So there's a number of things that one can do, and we can do a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach or both. So the top-down approach, it begins with our mind. And, one of the things that is very useful, in these kinds of situations is mindfulness sort of practices. And that's really about being in the present moment. Because when we are in a sympathetic state, so when we're in the state of arousal, where we just need to respond to this threat, we actually can't be present. It's just not possible. So the system is switched on, and it's impossible for us to really focus ourselves back into the present moment. And so then that's when it becomes really important to make it a conscious practice. Because the system is so reactive, we want to make it a conscious practice to come back to the present. And that's where things like meditation become so useful, is that we're bringing ourselves back into the moment in the presence of distractors. So we're really using our attentional control, which gets switched off, in those heightened states of arousal. So now we're making a conscious effort to switch it back on again. And so we're in the presence of distractors, and we become observers of the self. So now we can be aware of our bodily sensations. Is my heart rate, a bit elevated? Is my respiration elevated? What's happening inside of me? And just being aware, of what's happening to me, but almost from having a little bit of space between the experiencing of it and the observing of it. And that's where meditation practices are really useful. But I mean, I know it's not for everybody. So another useful practice is talk therapy, because these systems, like I said earlier, if you touch a hot stove, you touch it and you immediately move away. So it's completely outside of our awareness. And so that's when something is outside of our awareness, we do become reactive to it. So for example, if I've got a lower threshold of reactivity to conflict based on, my childhood, maybe there was a lot of conflict in my childhood. And so conflict now sends me way over into that sympathetic state, then and I just react, I'll just react to it. I won't even think about it. Then being in some kind of talk therapy then allows for, a self-awareness to develop, and a self-reflective capacity, and getting to know oneself, and getting to know, the different parts of ourselves, which then allow us to start responding, in these moments, as opposed to reacting to them. And so talk therapies can be a very powerful way of learning about the self and taking responsibility. So if we break down the word responsibility, it's able to respond. And we can't be able to respond to something that we don't know about, so those self-reflective therapies are really useful for getting to know the self. But if we work more then from a bottom-up approach, there's also a number of things that we can do. And I think the one thing that is, it's often spoken about, but I don't know if we ever really think about it in terms of the nervous system, but it's always available to us, is the breath. So when we are in a heightened state of arousal, when we are responding to something with that fight-flight response, our respiration increases, because we need to now get as much oxygen as we can to the body and then to the brain to heighten our senses. And if we can even just change our breathing slightly by taking deeper breaths in or doing the box breathing, things like that, what we're letting the whole physiological system know is that there is no immediate threat. So the system is responding to something that feels like an immediate threat, but it actually isn't. And so it's actually incredibly powerful in terms of regulating the nervous system, even though it sounds so simple, but it's also something that we always have access to, so we'll have access to our breath if we are opening our computer for the day, if we are in the car, if we are having a fight with our partner, whatever it might be, is that we always have that access. And a lot of research and things have gone into, the benefits of yoga for parasympathetic nervous, sort of response. But actually, all exercise in general, because the more sort of metabolic functioning that we have, the less sympathetic response we're going to have. So for example, if I get really angry about something, I could either react to that anger, or, I can go for a run, or I can do some boxing, or I can do something. So even just doing those small things then still allows for some kind of outlet for that buildup of the cortisol and the adrenaline, which is really important. And we know these things, like we kind of have this idea of these concepts, but if we really sort of link them to the nervous system, then I think that that makes them really meaningful. And then just one other thing that I wanted to mention, but this could also be, a whole nother talk. So I'll just mention it briefly is, um, so we've got this vagal nerve as well. We've got the vagus nerve, which is implicated in this whole system. And I think people are also becoming a lot more aware of polyvagal therapies. And really what it is, it's a nerve that kind of it innervates throughout our body. It goes in our chest, it goes in our stomach, it goes all the way into our colon. So that's why when you feel scared, you feel it in your chest. When you feel sick to your stomach, you literally do. When you have a gut feeling, all of those things are because of this innervation of this vagus nerve. And what they've found is that we can benefit greatly from co-regulating with somebody else when we are in these states. So that activates in the vagus nerve, which helps us with our social interactions. And so instead of trying to regulate ourselves on our own, it really becomes very useful for us to co-regulate with another person. And that could be with a therapist or with a partner or with a friend, whatever that might be. But that, we are wired to be social beings. And so then it would make sense in terms of our nervous systems that if we can experience a reaction inside of us of danger, towards somebody, then we can do the same thing with safety as well. So
Sure.
that's also, yeah.
Yeah, Shona, I think I really want to delve a little bit deeper into the last point that you raised, because I think it's really important. As you've said, we are social creatures. And I think that one of the biggest affront of COVID was when we could not be with other people. It was a psychological damage to us, because we're wired to connect, we're wired to seek the other. So I want to speak a little bit about a dysregulated nervous system, if we were to say, and its impact on relationship building, and development of empathy. I don't know if you can say a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we are in a dysregulated nervous system, and so what that is that it is a state of physiological arousal. So, all of our physiological systems are switched on. It becomes virtually impossible, although incredibly difficult, to experience any kind of vulnerability in that state, which is really useful for, an interactive relationship. So when we are in that state, we are in this hyper vigilant, hyper aware, hyper aroused, on the lookout for danger, which means that then I can misinterpret, a lot of social cues. So if I'm really kind of primed, to be looking out for anything that might be threatening to me, then it's going to significantly impact on my ability to form relationships with other people. Because as you're saying, with COVID, we were separated from one another, and we really, I think, all learned the value of face-to-face relationships. It's more than just speaking. It's really about being in the presence of somebody else that is so regulatory for our nervous systems. But if we are in these kind of heightened states of arousal, we can misinterpret social cues. We can become very reactive to what another person says or does, and sometimes it's quite out of proportion as well. And so that can lead to high conflict situations. It can lead to a massive breakdown in verbal and non-verbal communication between people. And so I think, we underestimate the social nature that we need and that we actually require in order to be able to regulate our nervous systems. And that has to be in a face-to-face kind of way, which is what we learned with COVID. We didn't have access to. And I think then, obviously with COVID, we're in the presence of this virus that's nowhere and everywhere, and you can be absolutely fine, or you can you know die from it, or there was just so much of this ambiguity and these kind of mixed messages, and we didn't really know enough about it. So we were bombarded by stress, and then we were separated from one another. It was, in terms of nervous system functioning, it was the effect of that was tremendous. It was absolutely tremendous because it goes against our very nature of being social beings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are, but I think that COVID was a type of trauma,
Absolutely,
to us, and we're still recovering from it. That there was
absolutely.
so much dysregulation internally, but also externally, as you've said,
Mm,
that there was
mm,
this thing that was dominating us, and really impacting our
mm.
mental state. And then Shona, oh yeah, go ahead. You wanted
No,
to
I just
say
wanted
something?
to add to that, Bea. I just wanted to say, the other thing with COVID is that we were wearing masks. So even when we were in the presence of other people, much of our expression and our nonverbal communication was hidden. And where, we've seen quite a lot of difficulty, with that is in the children that were developing kind of their auditory and language functions at that time, have always been behind masks, were speaking behind masks. They were never able to read lips. They were like everything was kind of um, I suppose, distorted by the masks. And so, there's been quite a significant incline in children that have needed speech and language therapy as a consequence of that. And that's really, I think, quite a real example about how there can be a stressor in the environment that can impact upon our mind, but then also on our brain. That this whole system is responding to things that are happening in the environment. So we can have, our kind of loneliness and mood difficulties and things like that, and we can have actual, developmental difficulties in the brain, and then also in terms of how our bodies are functioning during that time as well.
Sure. That's a very interesting stat. I think that there's so many outcomes from COVID that we're still really grappling with, and needing to understand and learn.
Mm.
Yeah.
Especially with
So
like
Shona,
communication. Yeah.
especially with
With social communication.
social
Yeah.
communication, yes, and
Mm.
we've retreated, right? We've
Mm.
retreated into ourselves, and I think people, what I'm experiencing and seeing, is that people are struggling to come out of that
Mm.
retreat. We went
Mm.
very deep into our own internal spaces, and we're struggling to still come out of that. And people are
Mm.
having to mobilize themselves once again to really do this new normal.
Yeah, and we were in an unsafe environment. That was the thing, is that there were no cues for safety within our environments. It was really like this pervasive, threatening space, wherever we were, even if we were at home, whether we were at the shops, wherever we were, it was, an incredibly unsafe environment. And because of that, our nervous systems responded in great ways. Mm.
Absolutely. Shona, we are going to take some questions shortly. So I'm just going to ask the viewers to please just send their questions through, so that Shona can address them. We have about 10 minutes left, and we will use that for the Q&A session. But as the questions are coming up, Shona, the other thought that I had, or what I wondered about, was, growing up, I don't know if this was the case for you, but, there was such a high incidence of what we call lifestyle diseases, right? Like hypertension or high blood pressure. And I was wondering where does it fit into this conversation?
So, yeah, I mean, that is a good question because, when we are in these, sympathetic states, these high arousal, highly activated states, is that one of the things that's significantly impacted is our blood pressure. So, and it has to be necessarily, because if we are going to respond to something, then, we need to have blood pressure in our bodies to be able to either fight the thing or to get away from it. And so again, these are all sorts of things that happen. If they happen on an ongoing basis, they can lead to illness. And so things like high blood pressure, it could be related to this. I mean, there's other causes of high blood pressure, but it could absolutely be related to this as well.
Mm,
Um, I think what's interesting is that, things like that then have like a knock-on effect as well. So if you have high blood pressure, then there may be other difficulties that one might have. And you mentioned, or you sort of asked a little bit earlier about a vascular dementia, and that's when we start to see the effects of high blood pressure and things like cholesterol and obesity and things, how they actually impact upon the brain, where there is damage to the blood vessels in the brain that then also start to create this chain reaction of neurons getting damaged, and then we start to see a dementing process as well. But yeah, things like high blood pressure, and like we said earlier, asthma, in your lungs, um,
mm,
difficulty with a lot of those physiological processes that in the state of stress over all this time, can really lead to severe health issues.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah, and I suppose it's one of those things where, Shona, when you're surrounded by such a high incidence, you start to think that it's normal, and you
Mhm.
normalize it, and you just
Mm.
sort of think that that's what happens as you age or as you grow.
Yeah.
But I suppose what I'm hearing from you today is that that's not the case. Actually, is that there is something about a nervous system functioning that's a little bit compromised, and that we need to pay attention to.
I mean, I think it's also very important for us to be aware that, there are genetic predispositions towards these things. And, these are very sort of complex, multi-layered processes that happen. Is that if you have got a genetic predisposition towards some kind of vascular issue, then the lifestyle that we have will impact upon that. And if you don't, then maybe it's more protective. So there are kind of underlying, genetic factors as well, and in terms of how the endocrine system is functioning and all of this. So I wouldn't say it's linear in the sense that,
Mm,
if we experience stress, this is what's going to happen to us. But I think, the message is the nervous system is interfacing with our environment all the time, and we really need to be protective of it, for a
mm,
number of reasons, that include cognitive decline, that include, our physical health, and that include our emotional well-being and our mental health as well.
mm, mm. Sure. Thanks, Shona. Let's go over to the chat box and see if we have any questions from our viewers. We have about 5 minutes left on our webinar. Let's see if there's a question that comes up. I hope that people had their notebooks or they were taking down notes throughout the conversation, because I think that it was such a rich conversation in just sort of helping us understand how all of these systems interact and impact us daily.
Mm.
And I don't know if you agree with this saying, which can sound quite quite crude, is that, or graphic, let me say, when you're speaking about predispositions, that you know we have genetics, right? Genetics load the gun, but
Yes,
our lifestyle triggers the gun.
yes,
So how we
absolutely.
live our lives and how we take care of our mind, body, and spirit actually triggers those genetic predispositions.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some processes that become quite a bit more complex than that, but I think on the whole, that is a very apt way of understanding it. B, I'm very aware that when we start to speak about the nervous system and the impact that it has on our various kind of systems, is that it does become very anatomical. So it's
Mm,
about this system and that system, and like how all of these different things come together, and then this brain function is doing that, and then this axis is doing this, etc. But I think, if we just think about the nervous system as regulatory in the sense that, our nervous system can activate, which is a protective mechanism, and then it can regulate, which is where we start to develop and we have well-being and we are kind of able to restore ourselves and we're able to rest. And then in response to stress, the next system comes back on again. And so we've got this regulation, and resilience for us is about balancing that regulation. So it's not about saying we're never going to have stress, and it's not about saying that we're only ever going to live in these stressful environments, but it's more about just finding ways of balancing that regulation, knowing that if it's not in regulation, then there starts to become some problems. I'm just looking and I'm seeing one question, B. I don't know if I can just read it quickly.
Yes, please go
But
ahead.
why is it that the inflammation caused by stress has an adverse physiological effect, contrary to the healing effect that the cell inflammation has on a cut? And it's a really good question, because it is actually the same physiological effect, but if it goes on chronically, so if it goes on much longer than what the body can actually keep up with, then that's when it starts to have the adverse physiological effect. So, for example, if I have a deadline coming up and I become incredibly stressed about my deadline, then I'm likely also to have some inflammatory function, and from the high levels of cortisol, from the high levels of adrenaline. But it's for that period, that short period of time, so that immediate or short-term period, then my body can work at bringing down that inflammation and re-regulating. But if I live at that level continuously, ongoing way, then that's when the damage starts to happen. So initially, they are doing the same thing. It's a protective physiological mechanism. We're trying to promote a healing process. But if we're now overloading that system, in the same way with the immune system, if we're overloading the immune system, then eventually it's going to turn in on itself, and then that's when it becomes adverse.
Sure. Thanks, Shona. And I think there's another question that came up. Are you able to see it and read it on your side?
Does the human body have the capabilities to deal with all that life throws at us? I think that's an excellent question. In theory, no, because life is continuously throwing things at us. So I think that it's dependent on a number of things. So we've got these kind of baselines. So when I talk about regulation, it's also about bringing the body back to baseline. And if you have experienced a huge amount of trauma, that there's just been like a huge amount of struggle, then your baseline is going to be different to somebody who has never experienced trauma, and that's lived a relatively protective life. And so, we need to also think about the resilience in that aspect, is that you can have somebody that's, really experienced a huge amount of hardship that is incredibly resilient, in which case then they can probably take on a lot more hardship because they're resilient. Or you can have somebody that's, had all of this hardship that then is actually burnt out, and is unable to take on any more. And so I think it depends, on that. It also depends on our genetics. So it does depend on what is actually loaded in the gun. And how, how much we can actually work with that. So there are a lot of lifestyle factors. I didn't really get to I know, B, you and I spoke before about that mind, brain, gut axis, and how all of this plays a role in that as well. There are also a number of things that we can do from a nutritional standpoint as well, that I didn't discuss at all today, that also is very protective in terms of these regulatory functions. So it's about looking at, first of all, the genes, that somebody has, what they've experienced early in their life. I think, as psychologists, we know that the first 3 years of life are absolutely paramount, in terms of what we can handle later on. And then also resilience. We need to sort of think of ways that foster resilience for people as well, because those are the things that differentiate how people manage. But I do want to say, in general, I don't know that we can handle all of this, although we all handle COVID, and then, you go into the next thing, and yeah, we have to be resilient.
And I suppose human narcissism helps to think that we can take on anything. That is a
Yeah,
protective factor, I suppose.
it is. It's absolutely a protective factor.
Protective
Yeah.
factor.
Yeah.
All right, Shona, let's take one last question. I see there's a question there on screen that says, why does the inflammation, why does, I can't see clearly from my side.
Oh, I think that's the one that we answered, B. There's another one that's using Hooke's law as an analogy. I wonder at which point our
Oh,
cells lose elasticity to bounce back and continue. I think, I'm not familiar with Hooke's law, but what I can say is that, again, I think that the elasticity and the plasticity that we see in our cells and in the nervous system is also really dependent on what we are predisposed towards. And then also, like, I recently learned about, how the process of oxidation, in terms of our cells and our cell structure, is so dependent on genetics, and I didn't know that. So the process of oxidation also is how fast or how slow we age. And so all of these things, like, there's all of these factors that will play a role in that. And I think there's some things that, we've been handed this, and this is our genetic predisposition, and, this is the hand that we've been dealt. But then what can we do, to try to mitigate this as much as possible? What can we do to compensate for any difficulties that we may have, any risk factors that we may have? How can we protect our nervous system? How can we protect our brain, from the inevitability of how difficult life can be?
Sure. Thank you so much, Shona. I think we could go on and on and on. This could be like a master class for 2 hours or 3 hours even. But we are at time, so we're going to have to leave it there for today. But once again, thank you for spending the evening with us and generously sharing your insights with us. I hope that our viewers have found it useful, and that they start being curious about their nervous system, their mind, their bodies, and what they can do to really take care of themselves. So thank you everyone for participating. Thank you for the questions, and for joining us this evening. We will see you again in September, where we will start our season 2 of On Being Human Conversations.
Thank you, B.
All right.